I'm Roberto Baldwin, and this is Tomorrow Today's Sustainable Mobility Brief. The transportation world is evolving at a rate not seen in decades. The transition from fossil fuels to sustainable energy has brought with it some truly exciting opportunities, but also some confusion. I'll sift through the noise and share quick updates on the latest news, trends, and advancements that will impact our world for years to come. This week on the Tomorrow Today Briefs podcast, we have ChargeScape CEO Joseph Vallot. Joseph, thank you so much for joining me today. Let's talk. You know what? Let's start everything when we talk about the grid. I don't think most people understand how the grid works. I think they think that there's just a giant power plant somewhere and just electricity just sort of happens. And the reality is far more complex.
Yeah. Well, first, thanks so much for having me, and very happy to start off with sort of a crash course on how our power grid works. Yeah, so the power grid, it's really an interconnected network of power plants, substations, transformers, and power lines that deliver electricity from power generation sources to the end users or consumers of that electricity. And the way our power grid was designed is really to operate as a system that ensures electricity is available on demand and to provide like a stable, reliable supply of power. And so, what we've got is sort of a system of power plants, right, that are generating power. Those can be nuclear power plants. They can be combined cycle gas turbine power plants. They can be wind farms. They can be solar farms. And they're connected to sort of very high voltage transmission lines that take those electrons that are coming from the power plant, move them across towns, cities, and sometimes even state lines to the end user, whether that's a business or a factory that might have sort of higher voltage requirements, or it's a home that has lower voltage requirements. And there are sets of assets called substations and transformers that take that sort of very high voltage electricity from the power plant and convert it into lower voltage electricity that can be used by the end consumer. Our power grid in the United States is actually not a single power grid. It's actually sort of a patchwork of a number of different power grids, some of which are kind of confined to the state level. So California has got its own power grid run by the independent system operator called CAISO. Texas has famously got one as well called ERCOT. New York has got its own as well called the New York ISO. Other regions have sort of multiple states sort of combining into a single power grid that's managed as a system. New England, the states of New England have got their own. There's a couple that span kind of the mid-Atlantic and the Midwest as well. And generally, those sort of different power grids are kind of actually connected together and actually engage in some level of power trading. We've also got interconnections into Canada as well. That sends us actually a lot of hydroelectricity coming from Canada. And again, like the one exception sort of famously is Texas. That's got its own power grid that's actually not interconnected to the rest of the U.S.
And what's interesting about the power grid, I think most people think that there's a power station somewhere and it's making the exact same amount of power at all times. And the reality is there's multiple stations, there's multiple solar farms, wind farms, battery storage, and they're all making electricity, but the larger corporations that run these systems, they have to make sure that they're making just enough to meet demand. Like, you don't want to make too much, especially if you're not using a renewable resource, because now you're just wasting electricity, but you can't make too little because then you get brownouts.
Exactly. Yeah. So managing power grids is this sort of constant balance between supply and demand. And that's why you actually have, these entire entities called system operators that are staffed with dozens or hundreds of people whose full-time job it is to keep that power grid balance. Indeed, as you said, if you have too much or too little electricity, it could also cause problems for the power grid itself, right? And actually mess up the infrastructure, cause damage to the infrastructure that then leads to more sustained blackouts. So this is an operation that has been refined over decades and decades. I think the interesting thing that's happened, certainly in the past decade or so, has been a real sort of scale up in the amount of renewable energy that we've got on our power grid or in power grids across the country. And as you said, power can't really, necessarily be kind of stored or saved, although that's changing now with batteries. And so the interesting sort of challenge that renewables have imposed on the power grid is, renewable energy varies with the weather, right? The windier it is, the more wind power we're going to get. The sunnier it is, the more solar power that's going to come from a solar plant. And that's not always, within our control. It's not always predictable either. And so then what do we do actually, with that extra electricity when the wind is really blowing or the sun is really shining? And this is where energy storage comes into play. As I mentioned, that the solution to this really is to just have batteries, right? That can sort of store that excess power when it's being generated at the time it's being generated, and can then discharge that back to the grid or to the energy user when they actually need that electricity, which is not always at the same time. I've been talking a lot about Texas. I think Texas provides a number of interesting examples. Texas has actually got a tremendous amount of wind energy deployed across the state. It's just a naturally very windy state. In Texas, the wind tends to blow more overnight than during the day. But of course, overnight, factories are closed, businesses are closed, people are sleeping, not necessarily consuming electricity. And so what do you actually do with that wind energy when it's being produced and no one is awake to use it? And the answer is battery storage. And, we've got companies like Tesla, right, that are deploying, kind of utility scale mega packs of batteries, lithium ion batteries that can store that electricity. And more recently, we also have electric vehicles, right, which are essentially batteries on wheels that can also soak up that excess renewable generation and then use it to power a car during the daytime.
And see, that's sort of the thing, because I hear, occasionally someone would be like, well, if everyone charges their car, then the grid's going to go down. I'm like, well, that's not how you gas up your car. It's not how people charge your car. But as EV adoption does grow, there is some real concerns about the grid. And this is where ChargeScape comes in. Tell us about your company and how it can help manage the grid as we sort of figure out, the evolution of our grid and how EVs and charging and batteries work into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe just to expand on your point, we're seeing now with the levels of EV adoption that we've got across the US that people do tend to charge their electric vehicles at home around the same time. There's sort of very common charging patterns that we see. People tend to plug in when they get home from work in the evening, whether that's around 5, 6, 7 p.m. And, their cars tend to, start charging then. What we've got with EV adoption as well in the US is we're still kind of at the early enough stages where it's still fairly localized. And so you actually tend to have clusters of electric vehicles, in certain neighborhoods, certain cities, certain parts of the power grid. So it creates this interesting problem where you've got sort of a cluster of simultaneous electricity demand that wasn't there before, and that maybe the transmission lines or the substations in that area weren't necessarily designed to serve. And so actually left unmanaged, that can cause real problems for the power grid. And in states like California that are maybe ahead of some of the other US states in terms of EV adoption, we're already starting to see that. And so that's part of why ChargeScape was formed. So ChargeScape is a joint venture of automakers, including BMW, Ford, Honda, and Nissan. And we're a sort of a private for-profit entity that really operates as a startup, as a software startup that kind of serves as this like connective tissue between power grids and electric vehicles to really kind of balance the demand for electricity with the needs of the power grid. Now, you might be wondering why automakers would be concerned with this kind of problem. And the answer is not necessarily with the power grid, but in order to balance that demand coming from electric vehicles for electricity across different hours of the day, you have to get the end user, the EV driver, to provide a little bit of flexibility, right, in their charging, and find those EV drivers who are happy to raise their hands and say, hey, I don't need my car charged right when I get home from work. As long as it's charged the next morning before I leave again for the office, it's fine with me. And the interesting thing is that power utilities are actually willing to pay real money to those customers for their flexibility. It's a lot cheaper to pay them for flexibility than to install new power plants or to rip up the streets and install new poles and wires to facilitate kind of more electrons moving through the distribution network. And so that's where things get really interesting, right? Because you've got potentially millions of EV drivers in this country who can actually get paid by their power utility for their flexibility in EV charging. And ultimately, that is of interest to the automakers themselves because that reduces the total cost of ownership of an electric vehicle. It dramatically reduces their charging costs and therefore helps them sell more electric vehicles.
Yeah, because when I have an EV, I charge it from midnight to like 8 a.m. or so. It's off the most off peak you can get. So I'm paying the least amount of electricity. And when you explain that to some people, they don't quite, they're like, wait, what? I could be charging my EV at this point where I'm going to save money. And when you're saving money and you buy an EV and you realize how much cheaper it is to drive versus gas, especially when you charge it off peak, then you're like, oh, I think then they start sharing the stories with their friends.
Absolutely. And I think you're alluding to what some utilities offer, which is like a time of use rate, right? Where you might pay less for electricity during certain off-peak hours. Not all utilities offer that necessarily, but what's really interesting is that regardless of whether utility offers time of use rates or doesn't, there are these, what we call managed EV charging programs now popping up across the country that will just pay cash to EV drivers for their flexibility. So we've got a program running right now with Eversource Energy, the largest energy utility in Connecticut, that's paying customers $300 a year to just provide a little bit of flexibility in their charging. And so, that's a significant amount of money when you kind of look at the amount of money that you're spending on charging, particularly charging at home. It might be sort of close to that $300 mark, maybe a $500 mark. So that's like a really significant amount of savings then that you can get on your charging, which drives your cost of charging down to, close to zero. We've got another initiative going on with Duke Energy in North Carolina where we're actually capping the cost of at-home charging to $20 a month or $25, depending on which part of North Carolina you live in. And so that's really sort of like meant to be unlimited off-peak charging at home for your electric vehicle. Now imagine, you're driving a gasoline-powered car and you're in the dealership and the dealer tells you, we've got a special initiative. You're never going to spend more than $20 a month on gasoline to fill up your tank. People would be lining up down the street, right, for a deal like that. And we're seeing utilities introduce these kinds of deals for EV charging, which again is just a tremendous value when you think about, all I'm going to spend on my at-home charging is $240 this year. It provides people an incredible amount of cost certainty, particularly in the high inflation economic environment that we're operating in now. That's a real savings for people, particularly as we move from kind of early adopters of electric vehicles to more of the mass market that's really been unlocked by this EV tax credit. People are paying really close attention to their fueling costs, and if we can help reduce those or cap those for Americans, we're really happy to do so.
Cool. And so if to see if a region or your state is doing that, they should just go to ChargeScape or should they just contact their utilities, or are you working with utilities? How is this all working?
Yeah, great question. So ChargeScape really operates behind the scenes. We're not a direct to consumer business. We're operating behind the scenes as this kind of connective layer of software in between the utility and the automakers. And so, if an EV driver is interested, just ask your utility, check on your utility's website to see if there is a program. And if there is, you can actually sign up through your automaker. You'll just open up your app. Maybe it's your Ford Pass app if you drive a Mustang Mach-E, and you'll see an option to enroll in your utilities program. You click a couple of buttons, connect your vehicle, and you're enrolled. ChargeScape takes care of everything in the background, but ultimately, what you as the EV driver are interfacing with is just your automaker's app, the same app that you're using to charge your vehicle every day.
Let's talk a little bit about like the sort of the future of the grid when we talk about renewables and battery storage, especially with, I think another thing that most people don't realize is those EVs, in addition to the sort of industrial sized battery storage that you're seeing out there, your EV is also battery storage. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned before, electric vehicles can be used to store any form of electricity, whether it's renewable or non-renewable electricity, in a lithium-ion battery, right? That just happens to be on four wheels. What's been really interesting, really over the past couple of years, is that automakers are rolling out vehicles that are capable of what we call bidirectional charging, or vehicle to grid. And so what that means is you're not only able to store electrons in your EV battery, you can then actually export those electrons out of your electric vehicle and back either to your home or to the power grid. And so, there are some models that have come out. I think very famously, the Ford F-150 Lightning, I think, was one of the first vehicles that's capable of this, but certainly plenty of others as well that are on the market. And what we're seeing now, this is something that ChargeScape facilitates in California, where actually the power grid operator itself, CAISO, as well as the utilities like Pacific Gas and Electric and Southern California Edison, are actually paying consumers thousands of dollars a year for certain levels of export from their EV battery. And so what becomes really interesting is that if you have this kind of bidirectional vehicle and you have some flexibility around, when you charge up the battery and then you're willing to discharge a bit of it back to the grid when it's really needed, you're actually able to turn your electric vehicle into a revenue generator. You're actually earning back a lot of the money that you spent on the vehicle itself through these incentives now that are available from utilities. And the way it works is, you would just work with ChargeScape and your automaker to charge up your EV battery, probably when electricity prices are cheapest or there's abundant generation. In California, that actually tends to be during the daytime, when there's a lot of solar on the grid, solar that needs to be taken up. And then in California, typically kind of in the evening hours after the sun sets, when everyone is sort of back home, turning on appliances at home and so on, that kind of 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. period, that's when electricity prices tend to be a lot more expensive. And utilities and grid operators are actually willing to pay EV drivers to export your power back to the grid. It's a lot cheaper for them than having to switch on a very expensive and probably dirty power plant. And so you can see as well, this becomes not only a great way for EV drivers to save money, but it's also a really great way to integrate renewable energy into our power grids.
What's interesting is that peak time is, you come home from work, and if you have a vehicle, let's say you have a horrible commute and your commute is 100 miles. Most EVs 250 miles. So you come home, you still have 150 miles of range. You come home, you plug in your EV around, maybe 6 p.m. The money that you're spending on other things, or you would have spent it, now you can actually make money again. You can continue to make money from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. with your EV, and then just let it charge, maybe overnight, or like you said, during the day, when the solar is really high. So it's an interesting prospect. And I think it's sort of lost because everyone thinks, if we all come home and plug in our vehicles at 5 p.m., it's going to bring down the grid. And that's true. But if we all plug in our vehicles at 5 p.m., and a lot of those vehicles are actually supporting the grid, this is huge.
Absolutely. And I think if you're an energy nerd like I am, it's really interesting. I think at ChargeScape, what we're really trying to do is to work with the automakers to make this kind of just a solution that the average EV driver doesn't really need to think about. People don't necessarily want to be thinking about real-time hourly electricity prices. People have families, they have kids, they have jobs, they have other things to think about and worry about. What we really offer through ChargeScape, together with our automotive partners, is a set it and forget it solution, where you just plug in. You've got your preferences set in your automaker's app that says, okay, I need my car charged to 90% battery level by 7 a.m. tomorrow. And then we're taking care of everything in the background. We're talking to the power grid. We're getting all of the real-time electricity prices. We're taking a read of your battery. We're figuring out when to charge your battery, when maybe to discharge your battery if you've opted into that. All of that is happening in the background, maybe while the EV driver is, cooking dinner, putting their kids to bed, sleeping, and wake up the next morning and your battery's charged and you've actually made some money. And I think that's what's really compelling to EV drivers.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Joseph. I really appreciate you chatting with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
For more information about the evolution of sustainability, head on over to sustainablecareers.sae.org. There you can check out the latest news from CES 2025, including articles about the Honda Zero Series, Toyota's Woven City, and Sony's Afeela One. Be sure to subscribe and listen every week on your favorite podcast platform.
SAE International makes no representations as to the accuracy of the information presented in this podcast. The information and opinions are for general information only. SAE International does not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast.